for aha Ghanatube so me mama kwaba and back channel way so and I'm when you say someone who draw a course or my gun no and I de ever who's for my poa and sell back be able saying good here with your dimension na yengutie in sem.
So clearly Africa is a place you know and love now.
Indeed.
How has the Ghana posting been when you were told you were coming to Ghana? What did you think about the country, and how did what you see or what you saw differ from what you thought?
Well, you know, Ghana has a special place in the heart of all Americans, I think. Very much regarded as Black Star Rising and the first independent African country. And that means a great deal, I know, to the rest of Africa, but it meant a great deal to African Americans fighting for justice at the time. Yeah. And it's continued to stand for something important to Americans. And the bridges between us are so strong, beginning in the transatlantic slave trade and in tragedy, but then being built upon by subsequent diasporas in both directions. Kwame Nkrumah studying in the United States and then coming and doing great things in Ghana, and more Ghanaians studying in the United States and coming home to do great things. And there are 1,400 American kids that study in Ghana every year. Yeah.
Wow.
So those bridges are really strong. So I was very proud to have gotten this plum job.
Because I see you did South Africa and then Malawi, and I think you've done Kenya as well. So probably Ghana is your first West African post?
Indeed. I had a lot to learn.
Ghana is described by some as Africa for beginners. And yeah, this is your exit. So we'll touch a bit on that. For me, the key thing is, having done 40 years, the world has changed, right? Because this will be early 80s or mid 80s that you started. And now we have a very interesting situation in the world where we are digitally moving. There's a lot of young people in Africa now. How has the job changed?
Boy, that's a giant question. That digital stuff has meant that there is more kind of direct Washington involvement. Back in the day, you had to wait for the diplomatic pouch, so diplomats had a lot of independence. Now your talking points are you go back and forth on policy matters with Washington more than you did back in the day. But I think the sort of fundamentals of the work haven't changed. My job is to explain a foreign government's policy and what they're thinking and the reality they're facing to my government, so we can make good policy decisions and understand your policy decisions. And also an element of people-to-people relations, because it isn't all about political military affairs or government-to-government things. The people-to-people ties really matter.
The world has actually changed in a number of ways, if you permit me. So, for example, in 1961, USAID started, and we've seen the work is done. 100 countries, tens of thousands of employees. A couple of weeks or months ago, you can say it ceased to exist. Such a thing changes, even for you who's representing your country, it changes the meaning of your work, doesn't it? Because these are lives touched, people you've worked with. I know some who've worked for 10 years in education and health, and then because there's a change in focus at the headquarters, you have to defend that. That must be tough.
Well, I like the way you asked the question, because you put it in the context of evolution. And I think U.S. assistance is evolving as the world is evolving, and as our relationship with countries, particularly developing countries, evolve. And as the countries that we've helped achieve middle income status and are interested in more agency and more autonomy, the beginning that you describe, I think, could be characterized by major infrastructure investments like the Akasambo Dam in Ghana. And there are a lot of Ghanaians, and me too even, who think that those infrastructure investments are very catalytic and want more of that. But USAID assistance evolved into more systemic assistance for health and economic growth and education, the environment, and I'm very proud of that work. I think we've made real accomplishments. You look at statistics like 1 in 4 kids in Ghana in 2012 having the malaria parasite, and now that number has gone down to 1 in 10. The number of deaths has decreased by 2/3, and that's thanks to work that Ghana's done with American assistance. And that's lives saved, it's kids in school, it's more middle-class Ghanaians buying Ghanaian-produced and American-produced products. It's good for both of us.
Yeah.
And I'm very proud of that work. And now I think under the Trump administration, it's going to further shift into an emphasis on commercial relations. And I've reflected back on things that President Mahama said, that said, essentially, we don't want a relationship based on aid. We want a relationship based on commercial ties. And Troy Futrell, who's the senior official for Africa in Washington now, was just saying that a commercial relationship is one between equals. And I think that's where we have evolved to now.
But you would admit that we are not equal in terms of economic powers, abilities, and in faces. For example, in July, when we attended, you were 248. This is the 248th independence anniversary, right? So as a country, you've existed for much longer in the form in which you're in than, say, a country like Ghana. So there's a place for aid. So even though we should be having a conversation on trade and commercial, as they say, you can walk and chew gum. So from a development perspective, isn't it regrettable that maybe we couldn't influence the administration to have a different idea or even persist a bit more with some of the programs that we know are so important?
Let me clarify a couple of things.
Yes,
One is,
please.
I think we are equals. Your economy is smaller than mine, and
Stages of development,
you have been independent for less time than the United
Yes.
States. But I think we must work together as equals. That's number one. And number two, I agree with you that there is still a place for development assistance and partnership. But I want to also be very clear that we haven't stopped that. And U.S. aid has been, the functions of U.S. aid will now be run by the State Department, by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And that's something, to be honest, that I've advocated for decades. I think that U.S. assistance is funded with U.S. taxpayer money, and it's a foreign policy tool. And it ought to be run by the Foreign Policy Ministry. I don't think that will cause any difference in focus or effect. I think that can be a
So let me get that. So
good
does
thing.
that mean that, for example, your programs in education or, say, trade are going to continue, just that it will be managed by staff in the State Department?
That's the second part of my clarification, is that indeed we did cut some programs. And I am sorry about that, and because I'm very proud of the work that they did. But many programs have persisted, in particular the life-saving programs like malaria prevention, mother-to-child and prevention of HIV prevention, life-saving mother and early childhood programs all persist, vaccines, basic medicines, and that's to the tune of between 40 and 50 million US dollars a year. And that's in addition to $25 million a year in security assistance, which is joint military training, things like the armored personnel carriers that I turned over to the Ghana Armed Forces last week to make Ghana more secure. So U.S. partnership with Ghana and assistance to Ghana very much continues and is very robust.
So that's happening to you. Just a final one on this. I remember, I think a year ago, I moderated a program organized by USAID, and this had to do with cashew. And I think this was a program to help the value chain. So there were different cashew farmers discussing how to add value to Ghanaian cashew and stuff like this. So the fact that we're moving into a commercial relationship, you would have thought that programs in the trade area, capacity building for exporters, that would rather persist, right? So I feel like there's a bit of a disconnect there.
I hope that some of that will continue. Some of that is still under evaluation. There are a couple of things that we need to look at in terms of the commercial relationship. One is making the commercial relationship more equal. I think that...
Thank you.
Okay, good. The Africa Growth and Opportunity Act has been enforced for 25 years. And that's given Ghana and other African countries duty-free access to the United States for 6,500 products. And that's been a boon, I think, to the commercial growth and export growth that you're talking about. However, African countries haven't reciprocated with the United States, and there are significant trade barriers to American exports to Africa and to Ghana.
Is it?
And yes, and
A couple of examples?
Well, I think the average tariff on American products in Ghana is over 30%. And you've negotiated, meanwhile, free trade agreements with our European competitors, for example.
They've been very aggressive with their EPAs.
Indeed, yes.
They have.
And so now we're having some good conversations with the Ministry of Trade and Industry and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs about ways that we can make our trade relationship more equal.
And let's move to trade. The way President Trump applied the tariffs, it gave the impression that there was no special relationship, which is a bit sad because Ghana likes to see itself as a U.S. ally and was hoping for some recognition of that in the way the tariffs were applied. So when we heard that Ghana take that 10%, I was like, ooh. So I don't know how that sat and whether there's been any movement on that since you met the Ghanaian authorities.
Well, I wouldn't put it that way.
Okay.
Indeed, there are 10% tariffs applied globally, which is a tack that the new administration in the United States has taken. That may be in the short term to Ghana's advantage vis-a-vis its competitors. Oil and gas, which is the major export to the United States, is not subject to tariff. Cocoa right now is, but that's a 10% tariff. Cote d'Ivoire, which is your major competitor, is subject to a 21% tariff. The same is true in apparel, which I know President Mahama cares a lot about because it employs a lot of youth and women. If Ghana faces a 10% tariff, but Bangladesh and Vietnam face 47% and 63%, because there were 60 countries that got a tariff that was much higher than 10%, that may redound in the near term to Ghana's advantage as the apparel market kind of sorts itself out. If AGOA is not removed, or excuse me, not renewed, then I think we go back to most favored nation status, and the advantages to Ghana won't persist. And so I hope that AGOA will be renewed, but I also hope that Ghana will be the one making that point to the American legislature, because it's the legislature that has to renew it when it expires at the end of September.
Final piece on this issue. I know you did some work in Vietnam. Vietnam and Bangladesh are really solid on the apparels. What can we learn from them? Because I know there are people in the sector who really want to crack it. And they see the US as an opportunity. I've seen a company, Dignity something.
Yeah.
I have friends in parts of the north trying to set up similar things. I don't know whether it's a financing problem, but what are your quick thoughts on how can Ghana really take advantage of the textile in this window, now that the Bangladeshi and Vietnamese are paying much more in tariffs?
I'll give you a big answer to that question.
Right.
DTRT is the company you're referring to, and we're very proud of DTRT because USAID programs that benefit many companies because they provided training to particularly women that work in that field. A lot of them went and worked at DTRT, and then they export a lot to the United States. But improvements to the business climate in general help Ghanaian exporters, Ghanaian companies that are here, and help encourage U.S. investment in Ghana. So and I've been talking with the government of Ghana about that my entire tenure. And I'm very pleased to see President Mahama make that his number one priority, I think. He talked in his inaugural address about improving the business climate as being essential to Ghana's economic recovery. So there are some things that can happen with the Ghana Revenue Authority, with access to credit, with a number of things like contract sanctity and payment of government arrears that will help make this a much more attractive place to invest for American companies and Ghanaian companies. And I will also say that small businesses, if Ghanaian small businesses are paid on time, they'll thrive. And if they're not paid on time, they can't survive.
A lot of economic diplomacy going on there. This is the point of view. My guest is Ambassador Virginia Palmer, who is exiting not just Ghana after 3 years of service, but we're told she's exiting. Is it a foreign service now or just public service?
Well, I'll have to think about what other public service I can do after I retire from the foreign service.
Fair enough.
You will see a formula was a moody which my equity and send no bet me and will comment no abreme. Now, Magibre Akinka Edia Moffe for me, guy will set channel we so Ghanatube so own subscribe, hit on the notification bell for quick updates. I was for CCD, Macron.